You're with Budgetmonk, and this is the third episode of my Holy Roman Empire guide, the Burgundian Inheritance. The beginning of this episode begins in the year 1454, and this is going to be my fifth total war, having declared war on the Papal State, Venice, Hungary, and Bosnia. As you can see, a lot of my allies will actually help me here due to this serious amount of favours they have gained from me handing them off provinces. Burgundy should not be underestimated. In my case, I was able to call in his enemy Castile, and I highly suggest that you guys have actually built favours with one of his enemies in order to aid you at this point in time. It is recommended to attack Burgundy if he is actually already involved in a war with France. However, in my case, I have a truce with all of my sort of objective nations, including the Papal State, Venice, and Hungary. That is why I'm using this opportunity to attack him directly. I also feel emboldened by having Castile as an ally to back me up, and I'm hoping of course that the French take this opportunity to also gang up on Burgundy. Now, I want to get it right out of the way by saying that the Burgundian inheritance is an objective good, and of course you are actually hoping that it fires. In my case, I was hoping that it did in fact not fire, and the only reason why is because I did want to basically prove to you guys that you can have a very enjoyable experience whether it does fire or not. Austria is one of my favorite nations, and I've spent one of the most times playing Austria above any other nation. And one of the greatest downfalls that I used to dislike about Austria were the RNG elements. And that is part of my incentive going into this series, is to demonstrate that you can just straight up have an awesome game as Austria despite having bad luck. If you do gain the Burgundian inheritance, my recommendation is to state up Flanders and Holland, which will actually give you a significant amount of influence in the English Channel. I then recommend that you actually collect there with a merchant, but not change your trading port, believe it or not. I will elaborate as to why that is in a future episode. Being locked to duchy rank as the nation of Austria, you have a total of 2 additional territories which can be stated up at the beginning of the game. However, one of your provinces in the Rhineland belongs to a territory which is inefficiently distributed between 3 other provinces which are not under your control as Austria. You do have the option to unstate this territory, and that gives you the ability to state up a 3rd territory. However, at best you will not own all of that territory either. So therefore my recommendation is to be content with Flanders and Holland and actually release as many individual princes within inside the empire as possible, and that includes Luxembourg, as well as actually returning, most importantly of all, a Burgundy once again via the one province in the Burgundy region, as his territory will now be inside the empire and he is one of the prime candidates to actually feed into France in a future date. Again, the Burgundian inheritance is an amazing thing because it does actually embolden your nation, but more importantly, it gives you a border with France, and it actually allows you to do something very similar to France as we have done with Hungary in the previous episode. In my case, however, of course, I was hoping the Burgundian inheritance did not fire, and I was content with this war here being fairly quick and fairly decisive. I did peace out rather than going for the whole slog against him and simply liberating some nations in order to gain additional imperial authority. Now, part of the reason I did peace out as opposed to continuing this war onwards was because the truces were coming up with other nations and I wanted to prepare to continue being productive. I do not recommend wasting a ton of time sitting on Burgundy and actually hoping that the inheritance fires. I have a lot of additional tips and strategies that I'd like to actually share with you guys throughout the course of the series, but I have actually been feeling insecure in regards to this subject, as I don't think those things actually pertain to the Burgundian inheritance. So throughout the course of this episode, in order to elevate it a little bit, I'm going to be dropping a lot of general tips and knowledge about the Holy Roman Empire, which might not pertain to the other episodes, as some of the stuff regarding the Burgundian inheritance is rather mundane. Before we get started with that though, we are going to be jumping into our second war with Burgundy, which actually is jumping ahead a significant amount of time, and I hope that that makes you guys optimistic that if you hustle, you can actually have a better game, in fact, than I did. Once again, I'm able to call in Burgundy's enemies here, including England, to help us out in this war. You guys will notice that I'm spending the vast majority of my time actually fighting outside of the empire, as opposed to actually trying to micromanage the nations within the empire. That is, in fact, very deliberate, and I wanted to talk about demanding territory. When I demand territory, I only ever do it if it's actually going to result in an independent prince being released. And the reason is because when you actually demand unlawful territory, that nation then has a truce with you, and a nation which is emboldened by a truce will very rarely return provinces unless the other modifiers are extremely high. And the reason is because they feel secure that you're not actually going to attack them. So I highly suggest that you guys actually follow that same principle. It's also worth taking note when a nation annexes another, what is their current state? Because sometimes they did separate peace, a weak nation, annex them, but they're in the midst of actually losing a war. And very often their rivals or enemies will actually liberate those nations themselves once they defeat the nation of interest. Another thing that might not be that apparent here is that I'm also using my ruler as a general, and assuming that I actually have an heir in line, I am always using my ruler as a general in an effort to actually promote them from dying off, and therefore gaining that 10 imperial authority when we are re-elected as the emperor. Now, with the same line of thought, if your emperor does continue to live on for a long period of time, make sure to abdicate him as soon as possible, for the same reason, to simply cycle through those imperial authority points as efficiently as possible. If you guys are paying attention, you'll notice that I am over my Diplo relation slots, and in fact I do spend a lot of time over my Diplo relation slots throughout the course of this series if you're looking at the modifiers up in the top left. This is something that I highly recommend you also do. As a diplomatic powerhouse as Austria, everybody is seeking your alliance, and although we will actually be ditching certain nations such as Milan once we've actually utilized them to conquer land and add it to the empire, I do recommend that you ally whoever and however many nations it takes to actually achieve your goals. As of course, once you reach that revoke, it is actually laughable how efficient it is in regards to monarch points, integrating land ultimately for free. As we come to the end of the second war here, pretty self-explanatory, just releasing independent princes and more personal unions from Burgundy in order to get that imperial authority. We're going to be jumping ahead finally to my final war against Burgundy, where France has actually gobbled a lot of his provinces up. However, it is actually a pretty small, trivial war. The reason it is prolonged is because I'm also fighting France in a imperial ban war, as Rethel, the province that he has taken, is inside of the empire, and this is a very prosperous thing to do because France has a lot of small nations which can be released from inside of him and therefore can actually join the empire if they feel threatened. It is preferable to actually eliminate Burgundy from the game and then re-release them as opposed to vassalize them, for example, and the reason is because his trust will be in a dismal state after so many consecutive wars. Some people were wondering why in northern Italy Aquila is released from Milan. Not only that, I also released Parma, and that was simply from separate piecing him as he was allied to one of my enemies. We are no longer friends with Milan. He has served his duty and added provinces to the empire. I suggest that you guys do follow that rule and always be separate piecing nations to release provinces or individual princes within inside the empire if possible. Another good tip is to not add your provinces to the empire, maybe with the exception of provinces if you own them in Italy, as reigning in northern Italy does add those provinces automatically without giving imperial authority. You do not add your provinces to the empire until you are going to add up to 50 and pass a reform. And of course the reason why is because things such as overextension affect your Diplo reputation, and you can end up with some inefficiencies where if you had added, for example, 5 provinces, you might be at 51 or 52 imperial authority, but you can't pass a reform due to your reputation being poor. Or even worse, you pass up to 49 imperial authority and you just want to wait a few more months to finish you off to 50, and then your ruler passes away, putting you at 59 imperial authority. This is why you always add provinces up to 50 when the time is right. So any province that you take is basically sitting in the bank to add later. And finally, let's talk about my idea groups. I do take diplomatic ideas as my first idea group, which is pretty self-explanatory. I actually view it as basically a superior form of influence ideas. The massive strength of influence ideas is that 20% reduced aggressive expansion impact. But as you guys can tell, thanks to these tactics that I'm employing, our aggressive expansion is really not much of an issue at all. I will elaborate on some of the strengths of diplomatic ideas in the next episode, so consider watching that before you actually take influence ideas, for example, because you wish to take advantage of the unjustified demands or some other bonuses. As the second idea group, we're going to be taking one of my all-time favorite ideas, and that is religious ideas. This is not really negotiable, and it is quite a necessity. And then finally, you can take the military idea of your choice. I'm a big fan of defensive ideas, and the reason is because it's actually one of the more economical military ideas. As Austria, you're going to have an extremely high force limit as it is, and hopefully quite some manpower contributions from the empire. Therefore, you're going to be limited to actually how many troops you can afford. And as our final war wraps up here against Burgundy, we're going to be taking that one province, of course, of unlawful territory, and probably going to be re-releasing him once he no longer exists for that sweet, sweet reconquest to be utilized against France at a later date. This episode was a little bit more talkative, guys, but I certainly hope that you found it informative. That's going to be it for our third episode of my Holy Roman Empire Guide. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.